Thank you everyone for being here. Once again, my name is Dr. Laura DeVoe. I'm a member of the Build the Era Advisory Board, and I'm located in Newton, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. Our mission at Build the Era is committed to making the Department of Transportation's role in American movement understood by citizens and activating them to engage for smart and equitable investments by the Department of Transportation and for better multimodal planning in their communities. I'd like to thank you for being here to help contribute to the attainment of our mission, vision, and values. Every year, over 40,000 people are killed in traffic fatalities. If this level of loss were occurring on planes, trains, or boating incidents, we would be talking about the loss of life in a very different way. Build the Era is committed to raising awareness of where each of us can take action, back initiatives, and advocate for policies at the state, local, and federal level in order to build up safe, equitable, and resilient multimodal transportation. And for this reason, we have invited Amy Cohen, the co-founder of Families for Safe Streets, to join us this evening. In 2013, Amy's 12-year-old son, Sammy, was a traffic fatality just outside his home in New York City. Sammy was doing what children do each and every day. He was walking home from school. Amy has taken her lived experience and turned to activism to make change in her home city and across the country. Families for Safe Streets was founded in 2014 in New York City and is now in 20 locations across the country. Its mission is to confront the epidemic of traffic violence. Amy and the leadership for Families for Safe Streets believe that traffic violence is preventable. Prior to her appointment to the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg served as the commissioner for the New York City Department of Transportation. And during this time, she was quoted as saying, "I cannot overstate it. Families for Safe Streets are among the most powerful advocacy forces I've ever seen in politics. If we want our streets to be safer, you really need the human beings who've lost loved ones. It reframes everything." Amy, I want to welcome you to this conversation and thank you for your activism. And before we begin, I want to say to you that I am so very sorry for the pain that you have endured for the loss of Sammy. And I'm so honored to be with you this evening to learn from you and your advocacy. So thank you so much. I want to make sure that folks get a chance to hear from you personally. But before we get started, I invite all those who are joining us to please post questions in the chat. We will be compiling them during the talk and turning to them at the end as time permits. We will be ending tonight at the top of the hour as we want to make sure we are valuing everybody's time. So Amy, talk to us a little bit about Sammy, about how his loss moved you to this decision to start this Safe Streets, and how it has framed your life at this point.
Sure. Well, this was my son. He was 12, almost 13 years old. He was in 8th grade, and in New York City, 8th graders walk everywhere by themselves. We only lived a few blocks from his middle school, and he was street savvy, smart, kind, the light of my life. And it's a heartache no family should ever have to experience. All he was doing was coming home from school, grabbing a snack, and going across the street for soccer practice. And that should not be a deadly act on our streets. After he was killed, I was filled with so much pain that it would have consumed me. So I chose to channel that grief into action and prevent this from happening to anyone else. Soon after Sammy died, I joined with others. We formed Families for Safe Streets in New York City. and right away started having some very big successes in making change in our community. The default speed limit in New York City at the time was 30 miles per hour. And my husband said to me right after Sammy died, if only the driver had been going a few miles slower, he probably would have been alive.
Mhm.
Truth is, we learned that to be fact a year after he was killed. A 5-year-old boy was struck in the same exact location, thrown into the air, but that boy lived and mine did not. And so, we started speaking out right away as a family. Then we joined with others and we made our first campaign for change to lower New York City's default speed limit. People said it would take 10 years to make that change because change in state government can be very slow.
Right.
We launched ourselves in February, had our first press conference. The legislative session in New York State is a part-time legislature. They end in June. And by the end of June, we had passed that bill. People began to recognize that if you give a face to this crisis, if you have people like me who've paid the highest price for society's failure to act, for our political leaders' unwillingness to put in place the proven solutions to save lives, we can make a difference by sweeping aside that opposition.
It's amazing how you got so much done so quickly. And we're going to talk more. I'd like to hear more about that because I think people really don't have an understanding of all the mechanisms of making things happen. It's not just one throttle that we throw. There's a bunch of different things that have to happen. So I want to revisit that at one point, but I want to make sure that we start um, early on in this conversation with focusing on terminology and language. One of the things that has is very important, I think, as far as Families for Safe Streets activism, is that you use language and you stay away from the A word, accident. You use terminology that's very intentional, such as vehicle and traffic violence, traffic fatalities. Why is this so important for the work you do and the activism?
Before this happened to me, I think I was like most Americans. I didn't realize, we had a crisis on our roadways and it was a problem that could be fixed, right? We call them accidents. That's one of the biggest problems we face around the complacency is that people don't recognize this is a preventable public health crisis. 100 people are dying on our roadways across the country every single day in and day out. It's gotten worse and not better.
Right.
And it's the equivalent of a regional plane crashing every single day. If it wasn't one incident here and one incident there, but happening all en masse, there would be outrage. Instead, for the most part, there is utter silence. So, terminology like crash and not accident is very important. Similarly, our mission, the terminology that we chose, which is to confront the preventable epidemic of traffic violence, we chose that language very intentionally. One, confront. There is so much complacency. We have to have a willingness to push back on that and employ strategies and tactics to make sure that change occurs. Again, that it's preventable and that it's traffic violence and not an accident. My son died a horrific, violent death, and it did not need to happen. So we choose
Absolutely.
words very intentionally.
I think it's important because language does matter. And especially when we have activism and opportunity to make a point, um, going at it in a very deliberate way is so important. And I want to applaud your organization for really taking hold of language as a key part of your communication strategy and your activism strategy. Um, the safe system approach requires supporting what's called a safety culture, and we'll put the links to uh, how the USDOT outlines safety culture. We'll put that into the chat for you. And that places safety first and foremost in road system and investment decisions to achieve our zero death vision. Everyone must accept that fatalities and serious injuries are unacceptable and preventable. I'm going to ask two questions here, Amy. I'm going to start with my question, and then we're going to turn to a question that Scott, one of our participants, has put up in the chat. But I want to start here. We know it isn't one thing that's killing people on the roads. There's a systemic problem here. There's a lot of layers of this. How can each of us have a hand in making the safe systems approach happen in our communities? And then I'm going to get to Scott's question.
Sure. Well, a safe systems approach is meant to be multi-level to make sure that we account for the fact that we are all human and people will make mistakes, and we have to make our streets, our vehicles, more forgiving. So a safe systems approach is multifaceted. It talks about safe speeds, making sure we have safe speed limits in our communities, both, urban, suburban, and then highway. What is the appropriate speed limit in each of those settings, and making sure we have federal policy that encourages safe speed limit setting. Safe roads. This is something that's very technical that until it happened to me, I didn't understand how important roadway design is in encouraging people to drive safely. So after you lower the speed limit, then you need to design your roadway to ensure that that's the message that drivers are getting on how fast you should be going. So things like bike lanes and bus lanes, they're not really just to protect the bicyclists or to make sure buses can go faster. It's also all about narrowing the roadways so that drivers, when they're driving, don't feel like it's a highway going through an urban area and they should be going 50 when the speed limit is 20, 25, or 30. So safe speeds, safe roads, safe vehicles. Our vehicles have been growing in size exponentially.
Yeah.
They are much more dangerous. When you get struck by a large SUV, it's hitting you in the body instead of in the legs and putting you up over the hood. It's also, encourages you to, you think you can drive faster because it's so big, and yet you have very limited often visibility with the pillars, and you're so high up. So we really need to be encouraging policies that ensure we have safe vehicles on our roadways, and is, tying all those things together by promoting them at the city, state, and federal level in communities across the country is what's going to make the U.S. safer. Right now, our traffic safety record really is horrific. We rank as a nation 47 out of 54 high-income nations. Bottom of the list. We should be leading the way. Most of Europe, Japan, Australia, they have half to a quarter of as many people killed per capita as we do. And it's because they've put in place these proven solutions. They are years ahead of us. And we need to catch up, innovate, and be the one leading the way in the world in terms of traffic safety.
Absolutely. And I think there's been other conversations about when it comes to vehicles, that all vehicles, no matter what price point you buy it at, should have the best standard of safety mechanisms. You should not have folks who can afford the safety mechanisms, the safety features, because they're paying a higher rate for the vehicle. It should be across the board.
Right.
And that's
We're
another
going to talk
piece.
about equity, regardless of your socioeconomic status, you deserve those safety features. And
Absolutely.
the EU has just mandated many safety features be required in all new vehicles. So auto manufacturers are going to be making them for the European market. There is absolutely no reason they can't make these for every car here in the United States. Those are things like blind spot warning, or giving you an alert when you're departing from your lane, or helping you manage your speed by having intelligent speed assistance and letting you know when you're going over the speed limit. There are just so many tools out there right now that everyone deserves to have.
Absolutely. We have someone in the audience, Scott, who is a transportation professional, engineer, and he has a question that I thought was related to what we were just talking about. How do we turn these lived experiences into actionable data points as opposed to anecdotal information? What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
I mean, we use a data-driven approach, and we use personal stories to elevate that data and to illustrate really what's happening on our roads. And so, it is so important to use both. I mean, the National Roadway Safety Strategy, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, they were based on data showing the solutions that are needed to save lives. And so I do think it's important. And, when we talk about what people can do in their communities, I think you have to really look at what is happening in your community, what is the proven solution that is lacking in your community. And if you are an advocate, can you elevate the voices of those who've been personally impacted to help bring attention to this crisis?
Absolutely. Data is great. Data is actually the thing that I think gets people's attention, but then the human element is what actually makes change. It's easy to look at numbers on a piece of paper and just consider it numbers. When you see the human and the humans that are impacted, it absolutely changes how people see that. Um, and then Scott has a follow-up. When someone says, "I don't feel safe," how do I incorporate that? And Scott, if you want to take yourself off mute, I want to make sure that Amy understands your question. So if you could do the follow-up, that'd be great.
Sure. It's not just a question I've had here. It's a question I've had with many of my colleagues. And it really goes back to that. What's a good way for me? And we haven't resolved this. What's a good way for me as an engineer approaching these situations? I understand road design. I understand speed mitigation. I'm a pedestrian advocate. I'm an accessibility advocate. But how do I take this lived experience that may not be, ma'am, I am sorry for the loss of your son, fatal, but how do I take these lived experiences where people say, I don't feel safe, or they know they're not safe, but there's no actual historical data to demonstrate that. And as a measure of example, I had this conversation with my boss today. We were talking about restricting U-turns on a roadway, and he said, I wish we had crash data. And I snapped at him and I said, no, we are trying to prevent crash data. How do we take
It should not take someone to die for change to happen. I mean, I will share one example and then I'll answer your question. One of our founding members lost her 23-year-old son in a very dangerous intersection in New York City where two people had previously been killed. It was sort of a 5-way merging intersection. While she was fighting for change, another person died. And through her activism, finally, they redesigned that intersection and no one has been killed since. That is not how change should have to happen. In Virginia, one of our chapters has worked with a local technical company and created something called the near miss app. And it allows people to actually report places where they were almost hit and tabulate that data. And that if we could gather that systematically, it's much better to fix something that is dangerous before someone is dead. You saved, lives doing it that way. So, just this perception, we know what dangerous roads are. You can tell them as an engineer by looking at it. Almost every, people call them stroads, streets and roads that are these large 4, 6 in Florida, 8, 10 lane roads that are bisecting neighborhoods where, people have to get for shopping from one side to the other and they're making turns left and right. Those are calling out for fixes. And we should be doing that before someone is killed. We had a member that she never let her son cross one of those streets, but his best friends lived on the other side. And when he was 14, he rode his bike across the street and died. And, she knew that didn't feel safe. Change had to be made on that road before her son was killed. He did not have to be sacrificed for now to be a discussion about how to fix Hempstead Turnpike.
And I agree. I'm still trying to work out how I take this to those above me who were raised in a completely different engineering environment that was 100% auto-centric.
Right.
And present it in a manner that is impactful enough that I get the funding to follow me. And to be clear, to be very honest, I work for a consultant firm, but I am a full-time staff consultant to the Florida Department of Transportation District 1.
There's a reason Florida is one of the most deadly states in the country. It has the,
There are many reasons.
overwhelming number of those very dangerous arterials cutting through communities. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I do think some of the solutions, the safe systems approach, is really all about making changes, upstream. So a lot of states have, levels of service mandates on when you're designing a road. You have to look more importantly at how many people can you process, how many vehicles can you process through it, rather than looking at, can we rethink this? What's the safest way? How do you process more people? Maybe those people are walking, riding bikes, taking the bus, having public transit, nearing that lane roadway, encouraging more people to ship to another safer way to get around, and then just making sure then the cars that do go through can go through. It's really rethinking the engineering priorities through state regulation and mandates, at each state.
And I agree with you completely. My roadblock, for lack of a better term, and I don't mean to be offensive there, my roadblock is how to present that, how to literally incorporate that into the set of data points that I use to convince others.
Engage your local advocates and have them pushing your Department of Transportation to make these changes as well.
Trust me,
so let's connect offline afterwards.
Yeah, let's make that happen. Let's make sure Scott
advocates us. We'll continue this conversation.
Yes, please. Thank you. And I didn't need to have a conversation. Thank you.
That's okay, Scott. We opened up the microphone to you, but I think there's also an opportunity here as people get to know Amy and the work here. I would say this, and I say this in many circumstances, is that lived experiences are some of the most powerful reasons for advocacy and activism to happen. And I think that there is a opportunity for all of us to learn from Amy to say, who do I have and what champions do I have in my community who we can turn to? A lot of times, we have to develop our own agency. And when the top doesn't care about what's happening on the down needs to start to push the top. And so we need to make sure that we're doing what we can in ways that every state is going to have their own nuances, their own politics, and their own pushback points. And, what works in Manhattan may not work in rural Utah. But you can learn from the spirit of both places to make it work for your community. Amy, I want to turn our attention to the fact that two important policies that folks need to see as opportunities for implementation in their communities have gone through in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. The first is the bipartisan infrastructure law. The infrastructure package provides resources that are going towards new and improved roadways. How dollars are spent is tremendously important. Communities can apply for grants to make their roadways safer, including roundabouts, sidewalks, crosswalks, things of that nature. And then we also have the National Roadway Safety Strategy, recognition that there is no single player or party that can solve this independently. We all have a hand in this, the federal government, industry, advocacy groups, localities, and a safe system approach, safer roads, vehicles, drivers, and a better standard of post-crash care. We need the resources to make this happen. People can get overwhelmed when they see big bills and laws that are passed and they're hundreds and hundreds of pages long. They also can get complacent because they think, oh, the bipartisan infrastructure law has been passed. Now everything's going to be great. I don't need to do anything anymore. And that's actually when the advocacy work actually starts, right? Is that the law is in place. And now we have to actually do something and we have to start to, rattle our signs and make sure folks hear from us, that we need to have things happen in our own communities. So when you think about these policies and these priorities that are available related to traffic safety, and preventing uh, crashes and traffic violence, what are the opportunities that you see that might be really promising in these two laws that we now have access to?
Sure. Well, let me start with the National Roadway Safety Strategy. First, I want to make sure everybody is aware it's a really innovative and critical document. It's the first of its kind. There has never been at the federal level a commitment to safety as has been laid out in the National Roadway Safety Strategy. It's the first time there was an acknowledgement that the only morally acceptable goal in terms of traffic violence is zero. Really, if it's not, if you think another number is acceptable, that number could be your loved one. So it is really starting at that, base, something that we fought for, that zero traffic deaths is the only acceptable goal. Traffic violence is preventable. The U.S. is failing miserably compared to other nations, and we can and we must do better. With the bipartisan infrastructure law, funding is finally available for the potential for huge transformation on our roadways. But I use that word very importantly, the potential. The federal dollars have always been given to states really almost as no strings attached. I mean, I'll even share this anecdote that every year, every state DOT has to predict how many people will die on their roadways, and they can predict a higher amount and still get all the money. So the only way that all of this funding will, potentially really be used to make sure our roadways are fixed with safety as the most important priority. We don't need more highways. We need to be repairing our existing roads and putting in place these proven engineering solutions to manage speed, make turns safer, improve lighting, etc. That's only going to happen with advocacy on the ground. States across the country are getting a huge influx of funding, and advocates on the ground need to be, bird dogging that, watching it, and making sure you're advocating for the solutions that we need. In addition to these big block grants to states, there are also dollars for safety that localities and states can apply for, such as the Safe Streets and Roads for All program and others that really can make a difference in your community.
I see that, Jade, you've asked the question is, how do communities apply for money? We'll make sure that all of the participants in tonight, everybody who registered for tonight, and then we'll include links in our YouTube notes to make sure that you know where to apply for information. Also, if you are not currently subscribing to our newsletter, please do so. We have wonderful updates on our newsletter that provide folks with information about follow-ups and give you what you need to get you to the places that you are trying to go, online as well as physically. And we have great resources here as part of it. Build the Era, specifically Jonathan French, who's on the advisory board, who's also an engineer and a Department of Transportation employee up in Maine for Maine DOT. If you could, Amy, I'd love for you to tell us about your insight into what you've learned about advocacy work, how advocacy work can effectively make our community safer. What specific tactics have you deployed that you have been so successful and effective?
Thanks. Well, just like a safe systems approach, advocating for it requires a multifaceted approach. So we are, elevating the voices of those personally impacted, but we are also working in coalition with organizations in our communities. So, for example, our fight for speed cameras in New York City, which was ultimately successful, but did require a fight. And that fight consisted of building a coalition with over 300 organizations, schools, community groups, hospitals. We had nearly every trauma center in New York City, at every major hospital. So really getting these organizations signed on in support of the legislation, joining us in rallies and vigils and lobby days at the legislature. And not giving up is really a strategy. Don't be afraid to escalate if your tactics of, writing letters and having meetings and going, to lobby days or having a press conference are not working. Figure out who is holding up the bill, who is your target, who you can sway, and don't be shy about putting that pressure on. I will give the example of the speed camera program, which is now the nation's largest automated enforcement program. That 24/7 we have speed cameras within half a mile of most New York City schools. So it's really an incredible program. That didn't come about easily. We had a legislator who was holding up the bill. He would say to us he was in favor, but we were hearing from everyone in the legislature that he was the holdout. Well, there were 5 of us as moms who lost our children, and we did a 26.1 mile, a marathon walk around the block over and over for 10 hours on a 95-degree day. That drew a lot of press and a lot of attention, and he got a lot of heat for that. We ultimately engaged in those kinds of tactics, including 2 rounds of civil disobedience, blocking traffic in the street, having the police arrest, mothers who lost their children, women who lost their spouses, people who lost their parents. It really got a lot of attention. And right now in New York City, the speed camera program is incredibly popular. People are requesting to have them in their neighborhood to slow traffic. So there was a lot that went into the advocacy, but a big piece of it is we didn't give up. Too much was at stake. So be willing to push back, be willing to, build coalitions, employ crazy tactics if needed. And, I will say I do all of this for my son. And sorry, it's still hard, even 9 years later. After Sammy died, soon after, we got back his last school assignment, which was an essay he was required to write on the meaning of his name.
Wow.
And he talked about how, from the Latin roots and whatever, his name meant courage and leadership and perseverance. And so I tried to lean on that and have the courage and the perseverance that he inspires in me.
And the tenacity that he clearly does, and that you have to keep up with the goal in mind. And sometimes it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes passion. So thank you for that. And you mentioned this idea of partnerships and kind of working with other organizations. Are there specific types of organizations that you find that Families for Safe Streets finds fellow champions with? Are there other advocacy groups that you've been able to join forces with?
I think as a movement, not just for Families for Safe Streets, I think it is critical to begin to partner with other big movements. So, we started with the hospitals because, and I think this is a mandate in many states. Trauma hospitals are required to do work to try to ameliorate their 3 most frequent sources of serious injuries. And so, with that obligation, I said, well, your obligation is to join with us. So, that is a key voice that I think many communities should build on. But I think there's also others that we do use, but we are starting to really push to do better. So the environmental movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, traffic violence does disproportionately impact low-income communities of color, particularly those biking and walking, because the proven solutions, such as roadway design, are often rolled out in low-income communities last.
Yep.
And so to really, join forces with those communities that have built strong movements already and have them calling for these changes as well, I think is going to be a very critical part of making change in our country. Particularly the environmental movement, as I said, as EVs are rolled out across the country, there's funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law for charging stations, et cetera. This is a unique opportunity that we cannot miss. It is
Mm.
going to be the fastest turnover the nation has ever seen on our fleets across the country. Everybody's going to start getting new cars much faster than they used to with those tax incentives. And we have to make sure, as those people are buying new cars, they are designed with safety as a priority, have the technology in place, have improved visibility. We don't need giant trucks and huge SUVs on our roads. There should be incentives for smaller, safer vehicles for all.
Absolutely. One of the things that I want to make sure our folks who are watching this now live as well as later, the folks in charge right now have been very public about this wokeism pushback. Specifically, the folks in the House of Representatives and folks there are talking about putting a lens on equity, and that equity is not as important as we believe them to be it to be. And so keep an eye on that. That can be another way that you can advocate in your own community if you have elected officials who don't believe that equity is important, especially around transportation equity. That is a place where you can step forward, and Build the Era has provided and can provide information for you as you kind of put your toolbox together as you move forward to advocate for equity in your community. A question came up from the group, specifically Julie asked, can you tell us the name of the app you mentioned for reporting unsafe areas? Do you happen to know the name of that app?
It is our chapter in Alexandria, Virginia, and I think they just call it the Near Miss app, but I can certainly share out information on that for your post release notes.
Great. We have a question here from Jonathan. It says, one of the major problems is that the current national guidance for states via the American Association of State Highway and Transportation officials allow for vehicles moving at a speed up to 45 miles per hour within 1 to 2 feet of pedestrians on a sidewalk. What interaction has a group like yours had with AASHTO to try to change guidance and standards?
Sure. Well, in addition to those AASHTO standards, for the most part, are coming from the MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It is sort of the guidance for all engineers on setting speed limits, sidewalk requirements, etc. And the MUTCD is up for review and re-release, and it had a record number of comments from individuals across the country on changes that are needed to make sure that the MUTCD prioritizes safety, particularly around eliminating a rule that's known as the 85th percentile rule. It is one of the most absurd things I have ever heard, which basically is state officials and local officials should be setting speed limits based on how fast 85% of the drivers are going. So basically, you're rewarding bad behavior. People speed, raise the speed limit. They keep speeding, make it higher and higher. And so that is something that we have pushed very hard for the elimination of the 85th percentile rule and other changes like the one your participant mentioned around sidewalk design. And so we are really looking forward to seeing those new regulations coming out and really hoping there are some significant changes in there. And if there are not, then I do think it's incumbent on, first of all, the MUTCD is only guidance, and there are not mandates, and you can go, it's a floor and not a ceiling. And engineers through, AASHTO and localities should need to view the document as such. If you can make your roads safer than the current guidance recommends, that is what you should be doing. As an elected official, as an appointed DOT commissioner, your number one priority is to protect the members of your community. And
Absolutely.
Safety comes first.
Yes. This may be related. Tracy asked the question, officials in my town in Massachusetts have said speed limits are often set based on how fast traffic is already traveling during traffic studies. How can this be changed?
So that's
Is
what I'm
that
just
related?
referring
Right.
to, the 85th percentile. And
Yeah.
again, even that 85th percentile, USDOT has indicated is a recommendation and not a requirement.
Yes.
So, California passed a law, supported by our chapters out there, that basically said, we're not going to follow the 85th percentile. You're not to follow it. It's meant to be a recommendation, and it's
Okay.
not a safe recommendation.
Mhm.
We are very hopeful it will be repealed, but if it's not, it is incumbent upon you across the state, across the country, and in states and communities across the country, to get your state leaders and your local leaders to say that they cannot follow it anymore.
Great. Scott has a question. I'm going to ask him to take himself off mute and ask the question.
It's not so much a question, it's more of a clarification. And I am a prospective member of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which influences the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is a device that I use every day in my career. The MUTCD is not a design guide. It prescribes what must be done within specific designs. The better look is that what is referred to as the AASHTO Green Book, a policy on geometric design. And I say that because when you start changing the geometric design, the markings of the MUTCD become different, and the 85th percentile is an abomination. I agree with that completely. I fight it every day of my career, because it does lead to speed limit creep.
Thank
But
you for that, Scott.
you must also design back to the roadway design has to support a lower speed limit.
Great. If you could send us that, make sure that we have that link. I'm sure that Jonathan has that information, but we'd like to share that with folks. So thank you so much.
Yeah, those two really do go hand in hand. And it's, if you're going to lower speed limits, you want to be redesigning roadways to match that, but you don't want to undertake a roadway design when your speed limit is too high, because then you're not going to be putting in place the engineering solutions to set, the speed that you are requiring drivers to drive at. So those two are very connected.
Absolutely. One last question from Tracy before we close out.
I just wanted to thank you for your comment on the 85 percentile. I just thought that was an unusual thing they said, because the road in question at the time was going right past the police station and the local DPW. So it just made me wonder if that was true or not. So I thank you for your answer.
I want to call attention to something that is part of our organization. It's obviously our YouTube channel. And we were talking earlier about making sure that vehicles are safe. Back about 3 months ago, we had a program with Verity Now, who work on updating crash test standards, and what that looks like. As we learned in that program, that women were more likely to be killed or injured in crashes because more women drive, but yet crash test dummies are not made in the physiological way of women. And so we are crash test dummying our cars with the wrong crash test dummies. So I want to make sure people draw their attention to that video from a few months ago. I think it complements this conversation quite well. Another one I want to draw your attention to is our conversation with Coach Balto, who started the bike bus program in Portland, or in Oregon, one of the suburbs of Portland, where the bike bus is a way for children to get to school on bicycles, rather than take traditional bus transportation. It's a way that has been quite popular in getting kids together, building a sense of affinity and belonging. But the roadways there, and Coach Balto has been very public on social media about the needs of slowing traffic down, creating pinch points in the roads to slow down traffic so these children can get to school safely. So two past episodes of our conversations are available right now on YouTube, and I think they complement this program quite well. Amy, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to give you the last opportunity to kind of pitch to the any updates on what Families for Safe Streets might be working on now, or anything that our audience needs to know that would be helpful moving forward, including how you could start your own organization in your own state.
Sure. Well, I want to return a little bit to the theme of how to make change in your community. And the number one message really is don't give up. We are at, a historic crossroads. We have, leadership at the US DOT that is prioritizing safety. The federal government is issuing, is giving out record numbers of grants to states and localities for transportation. We can't miss this opportunity. Your voices are desperately needed in your community. Whether you were personally impacted, this is a passion for you. You are, someone who's never spoken out. You're a community activist. We need your voices in this fight for safe streets to make sure that we can successfully implement the safe systems approach, redesigning our roadways, making sure our vehicles are safe, setting safe speed limits, improving post-crash care. We need you at this table. And if you would like to elevate the voice of those personally impacted, we encourage you to create a chapter in your community. You can learn more on our website, familiesforsafestreets.org.
Well, Amy Cohen, thank you so much for your work, for your advocacy, for your passion, for your tenacity. And I am honored again to have met you and to have been part of this conversation, which will hopefully help even whoever hears this will now know that this organization is available to them. These resources are there. And I want to thank you, and please be well.
Thank you. One last thing I forgot to add. Families for Safe Streets also provides support to those personally impacted. And I have to say it saved my life. And it's a moral mission for me to make sure no one goes through this alone. So if you know anyone, send them our way. We have virtual support groups, a peer mentoring program, and more. So sorry I forgot that earlier. Please make sure people in your community know we exist.
Thank you so much. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. And please be safe. And see you soon at a future Build the Era event.